In this section, you're going to learn about implementing Azure Backup for Azure virtual machines, followed by another way of using Azure Backup, this time for a hybrid scenario, where we're basically using Azure as an endpoint for storing backups from our on-prem running machines. After talking about backup, I'm going to step over to Azure Site Recovery, a disaster recovery solution available out of Azure. First, talking about how to deploy it in a Hyper-V based scenario, and then ending this section talking about using Azure Site Recovery for non-Hyper-V based scenarios. Now let me start with this video about implementing Azure Backup for Azure virtual machines. So this means we are running virtual machines in Azure, and we want to provide a backup for those virtual machines. So I'm going to start with explaining why Azure Backup for Azure virtual machines is still important, followed by walking you through the configuration and then also giving you some insights on how to perform a restore of those Azure virtual machine backups. Now, why should you take Azure backups for Azure virtual machines? In one of the early videos in this course, I talked about virtual machines deployment and related Azure storage, where you learned that Azure storage provides you 3 copies. Now, these copies are real-time synchronized updates of the live changes happening to your virtual machines, which means if you're deleting files, if your virtual machine is under attack by using a virus or something, then there's no real protection for your data. So that's why backup is pretty important. Azure Virtual Machine Backup provides a full virtual machine snapshot. So it's not only about taking backups of files and folders, but it's also about storing full system snapshots. It also provides you multiple backups per day. And then the restore itself is or using a full virtual machine snapshot, or restoring the snapshot and then restoring individual files and folders out of the backup file. And it's supported for Windows and Linux operating systems. Is it hard to configure Azure Backup? Not really. In short, it takes 5 easy steps to go through. When we're talking about Azure Backup in Azure Resource Manager, so again the new version of Azure, it's integrated in Azure Recovery Vault, so it's not a separate snap-in anymore. In step 1, you're going to create your Azure Recovery Vault, followed by step 2, where you define your backup goal. It's basically pointing to the target where you want to store your virtual machine backups. In step 3, you're going to configure the backup policy, selecting the source Azure Virtual Machines, so it's not that all your virtual machines need to be backupped, but it's up to you to decide which VM you want to backup. And then in step 5, obviously taking the backup in a manual way or even creating a scheduled task out of it. Obviously, when you're taking any Azure virtual machine backup, you also want to find something out about how to restore, which is equally easily than configuring the backup itself. You select the source Azure virtual machine, you browse to restore points, which can be crash consistent, application consistent, or file system consistent. The main difference between those 3 options: crash consistent means we provide you a full system snapshot, but it might be that the application or the database on top of the operating system is not fully recovered, that it needs some manual recovery process. Where application consistent points to the fact that the application itself is also being backed up in a consistent way. And then file system consistent doesn't really care about the backup itself, doesn't care about the application, but it guarantees that all system files are being backed up. Once you select your restore point, you execute the restore job, and then from Azure Virtual Machine settings, you can get a view on the restore process, or if it's a more complex, like special configured virtual machine, having multiple network cards, using a public IP endpoint, then for the time being, when creating this course, the restore was not supported from the portal, but it was possible through PowerShell. So with that, I'm going to walk you through a quick demo on how to configure an Azure backup of one of the previously deployed virtual machines. So from my Azure portal, I basically have two options. I could start directly from the virtual machine. So I'm selecting one of my pre-configured virtual machines, where I should find the option to store a backup or create a backup. Portal is doing a bit weird for the moment, but we'll get there. And I'm going to create a new vault. This is Azure Backup Vault. And at the same time, linking it to a backup policy. I can create a new one. If I already configure the policy for other virtual machines, then I can reuse the same policy, where I can define the backup frequency. A daily backup, a weekly backup, and then specifying the time. Retention range points to how long do you want to keep those backup files, where I can specify a daily retention range and a weekly retention range, even going to a monthly and a yearly backup if you want. Which means that, as I explained you, Azure stores backups with a retention of 99 years. So what will happen with this policy is that it keeps a copy of a daily backup, one copy of a weekly backup, a monthly backup, and a yearly backup, in basically the exact same way as you would configure your backup in an on-prem scenario. If I jump back to my resource group, then I can show you the other way for creating an Azure backup. It's by creating a recovery vault. So I select backup and site recovery. As I already explained, backup and site recovery is classified in the same vault. Backup vault 2. Obviously no spaces allowed. My mistake. And let's create a new resource group. Then giving it a little bit of time. So my backup vault resource group has been created, and in there I have my backup vault being configured. Within my backup vault itself, I select the backup option, where I specify my backup goal. My workloads are running in Azure and I want to backup virtual machines. Where in step 2, I again select a policy, create a new one, or reuse an existing one. So I'm going to reuse the one I created before. And then in step 3, I have to select my virtual machines that are not yet part of a backup job. And that's all it takes. So it will take another couple of minutes before the backup job in this way is created. And then I will show you how easy it is to execute a manual backup. But it isn't more complicated than this one. So now my backup has been configured out of my backup vault. I can select my server, and the server will be in a warning state. The warning state means that I configured everything from a backup job perspective, but the backup itself is not run yet. So I could go for a manual backup. then specifying the retention time. Since I pre-configured it for 1 day retention on a daily basis, it's automatically recognizing that. And I'm starting my backup job. Then from the notification area, I can get an interesting view on what's happening with my backups. So the configuration is done. And now it's in progress, meaning that my backup job is actually working. So it's taking the snapshot, it's transferring the data to the vault, and obviously it takes a couple of minutes before the backup will be complete. Then I'll explain you how to do the restore. So when the backup is complete, I again go to my backup vault, select my backup items, Azure Virtual Machine, select my virtual machine itself, and then up here I have a couple of options. I can select my restore point from the last 7 days, the last 30 days, restore the virtual machine, or performing a file recovery. And even if I go to the more options, I can stop my backup job, where I again have the option to retain the backup data, which means I don't want to take any more new backups, but keep a copy of the old one, or also delete the backup data, and then stopping my backup job. So that's what it takes to take backups and restores of your Azure virtual machines, where I'm already inviting you for the next video, where I'm going to reuse the concept of Azure Backup, but this time using it in a hybrid setup.